So this morning we're going to cover what to do with a queenless hive. If anyone was following last week, we were taking a look at this little split here and seeing whether there was a queen or not. So what I'm going to do is take the lid off the split and have another look and ascertain whether indeed the hive is still queenless. So what you're looking at there is actually another hive we've got open, which we're going to use as a resource for the queenless one. I'm just taking off this roof and prying off the inner cover with the chisel end of the J tool. Trying not to bang it like that. Having a quick look on the lid in case they actually do have a queen. There's a little hive beetle there. Can't see a queen, and I'll rest that up against the entrance just in case she is there. Now if you have a look at this split, they've still got quite a lot of bees, which is good because a couple of weeks ago it's more like a month ago, we put the frames from this hive over here into this hive and they had queen cells on them, so it's a bit of a surprise to find that they're queenless. But let's go through again and just double check that they actually are missing a queen. So it's called queen right when you have a queen. It's the beekeeping term for if there's a queen laying in the hive. So I'm going to lift that frame up, have a look down the cells, and what I'm doing is looking for a tiny little grain of rice in the bottom, which is a bee egg. I can't see any, and I can't see any sign of brood. Now that's a foundationless frame, so I do have to be careful. To look at the other side, I'm going to spin it on its axis so the weight of the honey in the comb doesn't snap it out of the frame. Okay. I'm going to put that frame aside on the frame rest that I'm using the shelf brackets as a frame rest on the side here, which is a handy tip. I'm going to go through now. Once you put one or two frames aside, it gets easier to move the other frames around in the box. No sign of eggs or larvae on that. Some beautiful fresh honeycomb. I mean, take a look at that. It's just it's a work of art. And notice how the cell sizes are quite a lot larger when they're using it for either honey storage or drones. They'll do larger size cells, about 6 millimeters or a bit more. Whereas the standard size worker cell over here is about 5.3 millimeters. So if you've got questions, put it in the comments below. Also, let us know what you'd like us to cover in coming up topics. We're here each week to help you get started, especially if you're new to beekeeping. If you're an experienced beekeeper, then chime in on the thread, give some advice if you have some for what we're doing, and that all helps the whole community learn. Okay. So I'm just going to go through because I don't want to introduce a queen if there's already a queen in the hive. No sign of eggs on that one. You can see they're drawing their natural comb right on the comb guide, which is a beautiful thing. Okay, still no sign. If you've got questions, put them in the comments below. But what we're doing today, if you're just tuning in, is fixing a queenless hive. Now this is a split who failed to get a laying queen happening. They did have a queen at one point, but for whatever reason, they don't have one now. We actually did film the queen in this hive, but now there isn't one. No brood on this frame and no eggs down the cells. So what happens if you leave this hive is they'll slowly die out. because there's no new eggs being laid and no new bees gestating in the brood frame.
Cedar, how long can a hive last without a queen before it completely dies out?
So if it's got basically, if the queen suddenly disappears, then those eggs are going to go through their larvae stage, which is about 11 days, and then they'll go through the pupae stage, which is about another 11 days, and all those worker bees will then emerge into the hive. So you've got 21 or 22 days there, and then you've got another about 6 weeks to those bees, if they're doing foraging jobs, will have worn out and start to perish. So you've really got about that amount of time to fix up the issues of the queenless hive. Ideally a bit earlier, because you don't want to get into the situation where there's not enough bees to get the hive going again, even if you insert a new queen. So there's two options basically now. Well, there's three options. One is you could merge this colony back with the original one, because it was a split from that, or with another hive, and that would save these bees, but it doesn't give you the second hive that we want. Better is to insert a queen, if you can buy a queen from a queen breeder, and that'll get them ahead, because when you buy a queen, it's a mated queen ready to start laying in the hive. Now the next option is give them the resources to raise their own, which is what we're going to be covering today. I can't see any brood or any eggs down those cells.
Tyler's asking, is there a benefit to having 2 brood boxes versus 1?
There's definitely a benefit to having multiple hives, and you'll see that in a second when we use another hive to give this one resources to make a queen. As far as having 2 brood boxes, I prefer to run 1. I find that there's plenty enough space, but in colder climates people tend to run 2 brood boxes. However, the top one usually is mainly honey storage. But running 2 brood boxes will give the bees more space if that's what you need. Okay, so we've ascertained there's no eggs and no brood in this frame. So what we're going to do is put these frames back together, and we're going to swap to the other hive, which does have a laying queen. If you have a look over here, the frame I've just pulled out has plenty of brood on it. Let's have a look. Look at that. We're seeing a nice amount of brood across that frame. That's what you want to see when you have a laying queen. It's beautiful brood all the way across the frame. So just to explain what you're looking at, these cells here that are not quite as see-through as the honey cappings are the worker brood. These cells here, which stick out a little bullet-shaped, are the drone brood, the male bees of the hive. And here's a bee here with orange pollen bags on its legs, and that's their protein source that they collect and ferment into bee bread. Here's a drone bee, the male bee. You can see the way it has big eyes that touch in the middle, and it's a bigger bee. Okay, so that's a very healthy looking brood frame. But it's got no eggs, and what you need if you want a hive to raise its own queen is eggs or really young larvae, because what the bees do is they then feed that young larvae as it develops on royal jelly solely. If they want to turn it into a worker, they start feeding it plant proteins or pollen. Now, we want them to raise a queen, so what we're going to do is give them a frame with eggs on it, which they can then choose to feed one of the young larvae royal jelly for its entire 11 days, and they will then also make that cell bigger into a queen cell. So they will make a peanut shaped cell hanging down. Now if I could find one of those cells already in this hive, that would be even better, because they would be one step further ahead if I could find a queen cell. I was just in this hive earlier and I didn't manage to find any queen cells. So what I'm going to do is look for a frame that has bee eggs. Now, when I pull this frame out, I'm having a good look down the cells for what looks like a tiny grain of rice. And from that, the bees will then be able to raise a queen. So I'm seeing very young larvae on this frame and patchy broods, so some broods hatched and new eggs have been laid. So we're after the stage where the eggs are still present. Okay, this frame may not be the one. I'm not seeing eggs down these cells.
Amanda has an issue. Her bees are not going up into the flow frames and her hive swarmed a month ago. What can you do to give her some advice?
Okay, we'll cover that in just one sec. I found the bee eggs, so if you look down these cells, it's going to be hard to see with the resolution on the screen. Maybe if I hold it up to the light, what you see is that tiny little grain of rice down the cells. Shout out if you can see the bee eggs down the cells. Over here a little bit further. Okay, so now that I've ascertained there's bee eggs, this is a great frame to put into the new hive. We've got some waggle dancers here, which is fantastic. It's amazing watching the bees communicate. Now, the next thing is to make sure we're not bringing the queen from this hive to the new one. I'd rather leave it behind and leave this hive intact and take a split from it. Lots of bee eggs down these cells now that the bees have cleared out of the way for me to see. So I'm going to have a good look for the queen. So if you're unsure of your abilities to spot the queen on a frame like this, then the surefire way is to shake the bees off the frame. So I'm going to do that now and just shake the bees into the hive. Now, if I had a queen cell or a queen cup on here with a very young larvae that they're turning into a queen, I wouldn't shake it because you can dislodge that larvae and she can drown in the royal jelly. So, but I'm not seeing any queen cells. There is a queen cup down here, but there's no, it's empty. So it's okay to shake this frame, and what's going to happen is the bees will just drop into the hive. So if you want to get bees off a frame, then you need to give a short, sharp shake. It's about the only time you want to do a fast movement when you're beekeeping. So I was shaking it right above the box to make sure if the queen was on there, she would then drop in to this hive. Okay, now you can get a really good look at the frame and see all the eggs down the cells, and there's also some baby bees emerging from their cells just above my fingertip here. That's very cool to watch. 3 in a row emerging into the hive. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put this frame into the split, just like this. And with any luck, this hive will raise a queen in the coming weeks. What I might also do is give them one more frame of brood. Reason being is they're going to struggle a little bit as the bee numbers drop now because they've been trying to get their split going for a while. This one's got a nice amount of brood on it, as you can see. lots of bees waiting to emerge, so that it will give this split a boost. So I'm going to shake these bees off once again and put that in to the split. Now the frames that have come out of this hive I'm going to put back into the original, and that will make some new space for the bees to continue building and the queen to continue laying. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments below. I'll just run over what we did to save this queenless hive. This hive here was queenless, no brood, no eggs, no young larvae. They were on their way out. So in order to save it, we found some frames in this box that had eggs on them. From eggs, a hive can raise a queen. So we got the frames with eggs and we simply put them into this hive. Now we'll come back in 2 or 3 weeks time and see if they have indeed raised a queen cell and whether there's a queen emerging in this hive. If you've got questions, put them in the comments below. The frames I've taken out of this box, I'm going to go back into the original one. I'm not too worried about sharing frames around at this point because this hive was a split off this one. Okay, pushing the frames together as usual. You want to make sure any spare space in your hive is by the side walls. That way you've got the correct spacing for the bees to draw their comb from, especially important if you're using foundationless frames like these ones are.
So we have a question from Amanda. Her bees aren't going up into the flow frames and her colony swarmed a month ago. What should she do?
Okay, so that's unusual. Normally bees will fill a box of honey and really pack out the hive with lots of bees before they'll choose to swarm. I have seen it once before, and it's basically genetics. I've seen it on conventional hives and on flow hives a couple of times where a hive is so keen to swarm because of their swarmy genetics, they'll swarm off before they've completely filled the hive. Now you've lost those genetics in part because the old queen leaves, so hopefully your hive will be raising a new queen who will then mate with new genetics, and then you'll have hopefully bees that will fill your hive before they swarm this time. Let us know how you go. You will need to check that they do indeed get a laying queen, so after a couple of weeks, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, get in there, make sure there's eggs and larvae and so on in your hive, and then they will build up from there. When they're weak in that stage, post-swarm, make sure you keep on top of the hive beetles if you have lots of hive beetles in your area. Use our pest management tray at the bottom here, or any other method to trap hive beetles. Now, if you want to encourage bees into the flow frames, sometimes some hives will be a bit resistant for whatever reason. The best thing I've found is lots of bees and a good nectar flow, and then they're straight in there. I rarely do anything at all. I just put the flow frames on and away they go. However, if you are getting impatient or you want to see that speed up a bit, you can grab some burr comb off the top of your brood box under the lid and just press it into the flow frame surface. You won't damage the flow frames. Just get it on your hive tool like that, press it in, and what will happen is the bees will go, that's not supposed to be there, and they'll redistribute that wax in that surrounding area. Do it where the window is so you can watch them do that, and you'll see that they'll start working those flow frames quicker. Any more questions?
Marianne would like to know, at what point do you put the flow hive super on top of the brood box?
So the best time is when there's a lot of bees. So if you have a look at this hive, there's not quite enough bees to warrant putting a super on yet. You've got a lot of space down here. I can see all the way through to the bottom. you've got some frames that haven't filled out all of the frame. If you have a look at this, then they're not quite ready for a super. The time is when they've filled out all of the frames, so that they've drawn them all out and they're working all the frames, and there's a lot of bees in the box. So if you have a look at this hive over here, this hive is certainly good for a super. There's lots of bees in it, all the frames are nicely filled out. It's ready for a super. For anyone that's just tuning in, a super, or new to beekeeping, a super is the word for your honey box. So any box that's used specifically for collecting honey gets called a honey super.
Susan would like to know where she can get a queen from in Perth.
Okay, there's definitely queen breeders in Perth. The best spot to go to, you can look online. That's probably the best spot to look out for. You can also join Facebook groups and bee clubs and find people that way. There's some great beekeepers in WA, so I'm sure you will be able to find a queen this time of year. If we were inserting a queen into the hive, we can cover that now. So ideally in this hive we would buy in a mated queen and insert it into the hive. Now typically it comes in a little plastic queen cage with about 5 or so escort bees, because the queen can't feed herself and the escort bees will feed her as they travel in the mail. It'll arrive in your letterbox, and what you'll need to do is make sure that queen has enough water just by wetting your finger, rubbing it on the outside of the queen cage. So the escort bees can grab a little bit of water and feed it to the queen as well. There's a block of candy at the end, which is there so the queen will slowly emerge once she's put into the hive. The queen cage goes in. I usually put it between 2 frames, and I put the block of candy horizontal. You don't want to put it facing down, because a escort bee that dies could block the exit to the queen cage. So I usually place it between 2 frames. Try and find a spot that's not all sticky with honey. You don't want a whole lot of honey just like mashing into the queen cage. What will happen is the bees will chew away at that candy, and a day or so later the queen you've put in will emerge into your hive. So that's how to fix it if you are lucky enough to be able to buy in a queen in a hurry. Otherwise, it's great to have more than one hive, because as we've just demonstrated, you can use another hive that has a frame with eggs on it, put it into your hive that's queenless, and they can raise a queen from that. Any more questions?
Heidi would like to know, what do you feed your bees when they need food in spring?
So around here we don't need to do any feeding. There's enough flowers with pollen and nectar around all the time, even through winter. We do get dry spells where there's not much flowering. We've just had one of those, but there's still enough around, as you can see right here with the flowering bushes. So if you're in an area that has a long cold winter and your bees have run out of food, there is no honey stores left in the hive, then it is a good idea to feed them. Better off feeding them than letting them starve. And to do that, you use a solution of sugar and water, make a syrup, and it's important to use white sugar, not raw sugar. So white refined sugar, there's lots of recipes online for the different ratios. There's different ratios that are said to stimulate either storage or raising new brood. Now, if you're wanting to store over the winter, then you'd use a thicker syrup, storing prior to winter. And then one easy way to go with a flow hive is you get a jar, put some holes in the lid, put the syrup in, turn it upside down and place it over the hole in your inner cover. So here's the hole here. If you type in flow hive easy feeder, you'll see me demonstrating how to make a simple jar feeder to feed your bees some sugar syrup.
I can also add the link to that in the comments.
Thank you. Okay, we're just going to push the frame closer together. We've got time for a couple more questions.
Wendy's just heading out to requeen her hive and is wondering how you can tell if they're really young grubs.
Okay, so basically they'll just be the faintest little crescent moon. Now from that they can still raise a queen, but if you're not sure, the best thing to do is find eggs on your frame. So have a look for that tiny little grain of rice at the bottom of the cell. That way they do have the resources to raise a queen from.
Glenn's asking, their hive went queenless and he added a frame with eggs. They now have 4 queen cups. Will this be a problem?
The answer is no. The hive will sort that out. The hives are constantly raising emergency cells and queen cells should the hive go queenless, or as a supersedure cell if they want to replace the queen, especially in the springtime, and also swarm cells. So it's normal to have more than one queen cell in a hive. What will happen is the first queen that takes reign in the hive will then sting the other queen cells. She makes a piping noise. The queens that in their pupae stage will call back and she'll find them in the hive and then sting them. And she doesn't have a barbed stinger, so she can sting multiple times and not die, unlike the worker bees.
Tim's wondering, how is it that your hands are not being stung?
So these hives aren't very aggressive and therefore I'm choosing not to wear my gloves, but I have my gloves at the ready. If I found that the hives were changing tune and starting to be more aggressive, I'd put my gloves on. If you're new to beekeeping, wear your gloves until you get really comfortable, and then you can start experimenting once you have some experience.
Simon's wondering if holding the frames up to the light makes the cells more transparent and easier to see into.
It certainly does. So if they're dark old frames, you'll need to position them in such a way that the light shines down the cells so that you can see the bee egg in the bottom. If they're a new fresh wax cell, then holding them up to the light, you can get light running right through from the other side, and that will really help you see those eggs as well.
Lakshmi has a great question. Why are you shaking the frame? Why wouldn't you just move them with the bees into the queenless hive?
Okay, that's a good question. Now, the reason is if the queen was present on that frame, I would be taking the queen away from this hive. Now that's only a real problem if I'm introducing a new queen, because the new queen would then get killed by the queen that came on those frames. In this case, I could have just moved frames over, and if the queen was on it, the queen would end up in this hive and that one would hopefully raise a new queen. The other reason is sometimes you can get a bit of squabbling between colonies where if you just move frames from this hive to this one, sometimes they will fight and there'll be a number of dead bees as a result. There's different schools of thought around that.
Reese would like to know, so where is the queen?
So the queen is in this hive. I did actually spot her earlier, just before we went live, when I was doing some beekeeping and looking through for queen cells. And she was a nice golden queen. She wasn't marked. And if we went through this hive, we would be able to find her again.
Ashley would like to know, is there anything I can use to save her plants from being eaten by other bugs without harming the bees? And also, they have an earwig infestation. Is there a bug spray she can use that won't affect the hive?
Okay, that's a great question and a great thing to be thinking about. Well done. If anyone's got answers for that, of different recipes you can use for basically insecticides that won't harm the bees. Now, even if you're spraying a natural insecticide, like a mixture of oils or chili or what, some people mix up things with like garlic and chili and things. to keep bugs off their plants, then it's still a good idea not to spray in foraging hours, because there could be foragers, even tiny little native ones, really down those flowers and you won't know. Whereas if you spray after hours in the evening, then all of those foragers would have gone home by then. If anyone's got some good recipes, put them in the comments below. We'll also put some in later on in the comments.
Stacey's asking, is there a good or bad time of year to try and raise a queen? And when is it best if you have a queenless hive?
So queen breeders generally have lots of queens in the springtime. That's the best time. It's a natural time when bees are really building up. There's an abundance of nectar and pollen around to really stimulate hives to do a lot of laying of eggs, and it's at that time that it's easier to raise lots of queens. So thank you very much for watching. If you've got any things you'd like to see us cover, put them in the comments below. We're here each week to help people get started in beekeeping, so spread the word that we're here to answer your questions, and tune in again next week and we'll have something interesting to show you.